Imagine living in a country where a loaf of bread costs $1.6 trillion. This is not just a fiction, it was the shocking reality for Zimbabwe in 2008. This African country, which used to be called the breadbasket of the continent, was now a living example of an economy in dire straits and immense misery for its people. Zimbabwe's economy went backwards rapidly in the years 2007 to 2009. By 2009, things were nothing short of a disaster. Schools struggled because teachers' incomes were grossly insufficient due to the rapid devaluation of the currency. They couldn't afford basic necessities, let alone commute to work. Teachers striked or quit to try to find some kind of paying work. Families had to deal with food shortages, evictions, water shortage, sanitation issues, cholera outbreaks, and routine prolonged electricity blackouts. And of course, student attendance plummeted. Before we can understand how Zimbabwe got to this point, we need to go back to the time when it was called Southern Rhodesia. The transformation of Southern Rhodesia into Zimbabwe spanned many decades of European colonial expansion, conflict, and eventual independence. The area known as Southern Rhodesia came under British control in the late 19th century. British businessman and imperialist Cecil Rhodes, through the British South Africa Company, BSAC, obtained mining and land rights from local rulers under somewhat deceptive agreements. European settlers, attracted by the promise of gold and agricultural potential, began to settle in the region. The territory was named Rhodesia in honor of Cecil Rhodes. It was later specified as Southern Rhodesia to differentiate it from Zambia and other areas. Southern Rhodesia developed a settler economy with a large and prosperous agricultural sector, relying heavily on African labour. The BSAC and the British government instituted policies that favoured white settlers over the indigenous African population. In Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, indigenous populations were not given equal rights to resources under colonial rule. There were systemic racial inequalities and segregation, similar in nature to apartheid, though not formally named as such. While not slavery in the traditional sense, these policies significantly limited the rights and freedoms of the native populations, subjecting them to economic and social discrimination. British attitudes eventually changed. It wanted to remove the stigma of colonialism. Britain in the 1960s came to accept that Zimbabwe should have independence under a black majority rule government. The white minority government of Southern Rhodesia, led by Prime Minister Ian Smith, were determined to maintain all the ill-gotten land and wealth. And so in 1965, they unilaterally declared independence from Britain to avoid the transition to black majority rule. This white majority rule government was not recognised by Britain or the international community, and they collectively placed economic sanctions on Rhodesia. Guerrilla war. The declaration of independence under a white majority rule government sparked a guerrilla war between the government and indigenous groups. This conflict became to be known as the Rhodesian Bush War, or alternatively, the Second Chimurenga, Lancaster House Agreement. After years of conflict and negotiations, the Lancaster House Agreement was signed in 1979. This agreement laid out the terms for a ceasefire, the holding of free and fair elections, and the legal framework for independence. It also included provisions to protect the rights of the white minority, such as reserving a certain number of seats in Parliament for whites. Independence and majority rule. In 1980, Zimbabwe held its first elections based on universal suffrage. Robert Mugabe's ZANU party won a decisive victory, and the country officially became independent as Zimbabwe on April 18, 1980. This marked the end of white minority rule and the establishment of a government led by the black majority after independence. The situation in Zimbabwe initially suggested it could fare well. Upon gaining independence in 1980, Zimbabwe inherited a diversified economy with an infrastructure that was one of the most developed in Africa. The agricultural sector, driven by both commercial farming and emerging smallholder farms, was robust, making the country a net exporter of foodstuffs. The mining sector had a wealth of minerals including gold, diamonds, and platinum, and offered huge potential to generate wealth. The workforce was literate, the education system was established, and Zimbabwe was positioned for growth and financial success. So, what went wrong? Land reform program. In the 1990s, the Mugabe government expropriated land from white commercial farmers without compensation and redistributed it to black Zimbabweans. The black Zimbabweans lacked farming management experience. Neither did they have access to capital. Agriculture, the cornerstone of Zimbabwe's economy, declined rapidly, affecting food supply and reduced export revenues. Fiscal policies and economic mismanagement. The government's fiscal policies of excessive spending and excessive printing of money directly caused inflation. The government printed large amounts of Zimbabwe dollars and transferred it directly to government departments to pay employees, increase pensions, and to fund the Congo War. This provided short-term financial relief, but had dire consequences. These transfers were not tied to any productive economic activities or investments. Money was going out, but no revenue was coming back to government coffers. None of the new money was spent on things that lead to increase in tax revenues or long-term economic growth, things like schools, roads, ports, hospitals, or education. The consequences of uncontrolled money printing were hyperinflation of unprecedented proportions. By 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate had reached an astronomical level, estimated at 89.7 sextillion%. Prices of goods and services doubled every few hours, rendering the currency practically worthless. International sanctions. In response to the forced land expropriations, allegations of election rigging, and human rights abuses, international sanctions were imposed by Western countries. These sanctions, whilst targeted at specific individuals and entities, nonetheless caused damage to the whole economy. Loss of confidence. The combination of forced land expropriation, economic mismanagement, and sanctions caused foreign investors to leave Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwe dollar lost value, and foreign currency shortages became severe, affecting the import of essential goods like food and fuel. The international loss of confidence in the Zimbabwe dollar also led to a loss of public confidence in the national currency. As a result, Zimbabweans began using foreign currencies, such as the US dollar and South African rand instead. Zimbabwe's economic collapse is a stark reminder of the devastating impact of poor governance and economic mismanagement. Once Africa's breadbasket, Zimbabwe fell into hyperinflation and poverty due to abrupt land reforms, reckless fiscal policies, and uncontrolled money printing. International sanctions and a loss of investor confidence further compounded the crisis. It's a cautionary tale for nations worldwide about the need for prudent fiscal management and political stability to foster long-term growth and stability.